Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 137 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Talia Kovacs for this episode, and we talked about a really important topic and an interesting one. It's about building resilience in our kids. And as we go through the discussion, listen for Talia explaining what she means when she says that resilience is learned, but it can't be taught. It's an important nuance that I hadn't thought about before. And Talia explains to us what this means for us as parents. So before we jump into my discussion with Talia, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. First of all, if you're listening shortly after this comes out in May of 2023, you're probably aware that Mother's Day in the United States is coming up this weekend, and Father's Day is right around the corner too. So I wanted to share a couple of resources with you. Both of those days actually can be hard. Whether you are a widowed mom or a widowed dad, you might tend to think that if dad has died, Father's Day would be hard. But surprisingly, if dad has died, Mother's Day can be hard too. And the same vice versa, the other way around, regarding Father's Day. So a couple of resources for you. First of all, back in episode 23, if you haven't caught yet my discussion with Dr. Tina Barrett from Tamarack, which is a grief support center in Montana, we had a really good discussion about Mother's Day and Father's Day and lots of advice from her there. And we also talked about outdoor grief support programs because that's her area of specialty. And then also, so I'll put a link to episode 23 in the show notes, and I'm also going to put a link to an article that I wrote for Parent Map, and it's called 3 Tips for the First Father's Day Without Dad. And the interesting thing, well, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but the tips work just as well for Mother's Day, and I really encourage you to have a look at that. It can be a hard day, and I think people wonder, what should I do? Should we go to the cemetery? Should we watch a movie? Should we make mom's or dad's favorite dinner? And what if all the kids don't want to do the same thing? Just lots of potentially difficult things to think about there. So again, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to the Parent Map article that I've written called 3 Tips for the First Father's Day Without Dad. And finally, I noticed over on Amazon, they actually have dropped the price a little bit of both the hardcover and paperback versions of my memoir, Future Widow. Right now, they have the hardcover for around $3 off. Sometimes they do this. I'm not sure how long they'll have that sale price, but wanted to let you guys know in case you were thinking about picking that up. Look for it over on Amazon right now. And it makes a great gift for yourself for Mother's Day, I have to say. So have a look if that is at all interesting. All right, so that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Talia Kovacs. Talia is a literacy specialist focused on building calm, connected households and on building resilience in children. She is also a former classroom teacher and a CEO. She's joining us today from Brooklyn, New York. Talia, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. And I've really been looking forward to speaking with you. I think this topic of building resilience in kids is certainly important for all children, and also especially certainly important, I think, for my listeners who are widowed, who are raising their kids, maybe young babies, toddlers, maybe grade school, maybe high school, up through college age, who've lost a parent. And so building resilience in kids and families, I think, is an interesting topic. So I guess that's a very long way of saying I'm glad you're here to explore this with us today. So let's just jump right in. I know you've developed a framework for resilience, but before we get to that, can you tell us a little bit about why are you seeing a need for building resilience in kids and families?
I'm a former classroom teacher. And after that, I was the CEO of Lit Life, where I ran around the country teaching teachers to teach reading. So I've been in many thousands of schools across the United States. And this is pre-pandemic. I am seeing a real uptick in kids who are just so scared to fail. Like kids who they color a little bit outside the line and they, crumple up the whole paper and throw it away. Or like they don't get the goal in soccer. And instead of going to the back of the line to try again, during practice, they'll like go off to the side and just refuse to keep playing. Kids who are reading a word and they get to a word they don't know and they just close the book and don't keep trying. And it's been rising, my whole career. I've been seeing this kind of growth in kids who are scared to fail. And I believe really strongly that the antidote to that is developing resilience, which I can define as doing the next best thing and the next best thing and the next best thing until you're okay.
Okay. And let me ask, when you're talking about kids, do you primarily work with like an elementary school age population, or what kind of age group are we talking about for this discussion here?
Yes, I primarily work with elementary age kids. I can talk to parents of middle schoolers and sometimes teenagers, but really my biggest sample size and the kids I know best are elementary age.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. That makes sense. I just want to hone in on what we're talking about here. All right. So building resilience. I mean, that just sounds like, where do you start? Right? Like that's like, okay, resilience. Everybody needs resilience. Great. What do we do? Like, right? Most of us parents aren't experts in any of these sort of things. So I'm curious what sort of framework you've developed for thinking about this.
I developed a framework through many years of trial and error. And the first thing that I want you to know as a parent, and especially as a widowed parent who, you might be doing this on your own, you might be doing this just in your own fog of deep grief and loss and pain and suffering, is that you can't teach your kids resilience. So don't worry about it.
Okay, wait. Did I hear you correctly? You cannot teach your kids resilience.
You can't teach your kids resilience.
All right, so we're just going to hang up and give up and like, we're done.
Yeah.
All right. Tell us more.
Resilience is learned from the inside out. It cannot be taught.
Okay, that's interesting.
So as the parent, our job is to set up the structures surrounding our kid to help them develop resilience on their own from the inside out.
Okay, let me see if I heard you. As a parent, our job is not to teach our kids resilience, but our job is to set up the structural conditions and environment and such around our kids. And then I forgot what you said. Something about making it conducive for them to learn this on their own.
That's exactly it. And so that's what my framework does. It helps parents set up the structures for kids to develop resilience on their own, which is the only way you develop resilience.
Gotcha. Okay. So when a few minutes ago you said we can't teach resilience, that doesn't mean we just give up and say, well, whatever. Like we have a role here. It's just maybe not the role we thought or expected.
That's right. There's no magic, like sit down, like you talk about like having the talk with your kids, around like their bodies. And there's not that with resilience. There are just structures that we can put in place that are really effective for allowing your kid to develop an inner well of resilience.
Okay. All right. Okay. So this is interesting. So what does that look like?
My framework has three main components. The first is, and I'm not going to use any analogies about oxygen masks, but the first is for parents to start with themselves, really to develop your own calm and your own taking care of yourself and your own stories of resilience from, the time that you were born until now. And the storytelling, which I do want to get into with you a little more, Jenny, because that for widowed parents especially is gonna be really important. But the first component is starting with yourself. And then we talk about creating the right conditions at home for kids to develop resilience by feeling like an important and valued part of a family unit, and by having some very safe independence at home. Finally, the third part is around building a child's own capacity. And what we go to as people who love our kids is, okay, I got to go build your capacity for resilience, right? We want to jump to step 3. And so my framework is really specifically chronological around starting with yourself, creating the right conditions at home, and finally working on building your child's capacity for resilience.
Okay. So the second one, creating the right conditions at home, that sounds good. What does it mean, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that's really around helping parents to understand where we're the leaders of our households, right? And as much as like your 5, 7, 10, 12-year-old might want to be in charge of their time, they're not, right? Like they are told where to be and when 99% of the time. So creating the conditions at home is around carving out time for play. And I'm using carving, or blocking. We could call block time for play. Like, is there play in the calendar? And play will define as time on their own without screens, without adults watching them. And we talk about keeping mistakes neutral and cultivating kids' own contributions at home. Less about chores and more about how do I see myself within this family unit. And for your listeners, for parents who have lost a partner, really taking that seriously on who are we now as a new family. It can be so hard with the loss of a partner to figure out this new era of a family. And so I invite parents to do that very purposefully and to not kind of fall into it. Not necessarily in the immediate stages of grief, but as time goes on.
So when you mentioned about contributing as part of the family, my mind, of course, went to chores first. Like, oh, I know what she's talking about. We'll get the 2-year-old a little toy broom so they can learn to start sweeping. And then we'll get the 5-year-old to unload the dishwasher, or whatever age, I don't know. But then you surprised me because you said you're not necessarily talking about chores. So what other kinds of contributions are we talking about if we're not talking about chores?
For kids, it's very much I am as I am seen. Whoever we say our kid is, that is who they want to be for us. So cultivating your kid's contribution to the household is about figuring out what aspect of their personality, what aspect of their interests contributes to the larger family dynamic. Are they the one who cares about fairness? And so then might they, very evenly distribute the mac and cheese for dinner and make sure that like different kids at different times get to pick the TV show? Or are they the really funny and silly one? And so might they, want to tell a joke before we start talking about our parent who we lost? Or might they want to, bring some levity to family game night and pick the game? So really thinking about who our kids are as people and how can we help them show up in those positive ways within the family dynamic.
Interesting. Okay, that's really interesting. Not something that I think I had necessarily thought about. Okay, and then the third one again, for the third piece of your framework was what?
Build your child's capacity for resilience.
Okay.
And it's last.
Okay. All right. So how do we start understanding that one?
I use principles of positive psychology, which is a new movement since the 1960s, to go from thinking about people as, almost puppies. Like it's a move away from behavioral psychology, which is reward your kid or punish your kid, and then they're going to learn how to do the right thing. And instead, it's really about all of us as human beings have an inherent set of strengths. So you helping your kids first see their strengths, second, use their strengths to help them solve problems. And then third, and very much last in this 9-step framework, go toward the things that freak them out, knowing that they have strengths to fall back on.
Oh, interesting. All right. Well, I'm glad you brought up positive psychology for listeners because, as you know, we've talked about this before. The children's book series that I'm working on is focused on the principles of positive psychology. So more on that some other time. But I'm interested in this context. So you're talking about helping to identify what your kids' strengths are and how to use those somehow to build resilience?
Yeah. For all of us, when we are going to fix something, whether it's a fight with a friend or math homework, we come to it with first, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And then the resilient parts of us, sometimes on good days, speaks up and is like, hey, you've done hard things before. You're going to be able to tackle this. For some of us, the rest of that sentence is just go back and review your math notes and learn everything that you've done, before in the past. And then you could come to this math problem. And for some of us is just start. You have what you need. And we want our kids to develop this just start. You have what you need muscle. They can't just start if they think that every time they go to solve a problem, they have to learn something new. So I can illustrate this with an example if that's helpful.
Yeah.
I had a student that I was working with who was, pretty shy and really funny and really empathetic. And those were her strengths: humor, empathy, fairness, kindness. Those were all strengths of hers. She's a 7-year-old girl, and her mom had many other strengths: assertiveness, perseverance, leadership. And so this little girl got into a fight with her friend. She came home and she was upset. And her mom was talking to me about this after. She was like, so I told her to be assertive and say, hey, you can't talk to me that way. And she was like, the mom was like, but she didn't do it. She just instead came home. And even though we practiced it and we practiced saying, hey, you can't talk to me that way, she didn't say it to her friend. And I was so upset because I felt like I didn't help her. And so we looked at it. Her daughter's strengths are in empathy, kindness, humor. She didn't have a strength of assertiveness. So what mom was asking her to do was learn a new skill and then use that new skill to solve her problem.
Oh.
Instead, what we came up with was, how can she use her strengths to solve problems? Okay, she can go back to, she's very empathetic, she's very kind, she's very funny. Could she pull her friend aside instead and say, hey, I hurt my feelings when you did this. Is there something happening with you? That's not mom's style at all, but that is the little girl's style. And so the mom gave her that suggestion, and she came home and she was able to talk to her friend, and her friend was jealous because she was in a better reading group than the friend was. And fine, they kind of got to the bottom of it for that day until next week when something else will come up, But the big lesson there is, we already have strengths. We don't have everything we need. Of course, we're always learning and growing, but we've got something where we can just start and solve a problem on our own using what we have. And then if we need other skills, we can acquire them. But it's in the
super
starting.
Interesting. Yeah. This is super interesting. So if we're trying to solve a problem, in the example you gave, the girl with the conflict with the peer, with the friend, thinking first to what are the strengths and skills that we already have where we don't need to learn something new in order to solve that problem. We
That's it.
Yeah, exercise a strength we already have. How can we use that strength? And so that is so interesting.
Yeah, and I actually have, this is pretty complex stuff. And so I do actually have a PDF that I would be happy to send your listeners, really
please.
Outlining 5 steps of helping your kids use their strengths to solve problems.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, if we can connect after, maybe we can put a link in the show notes.
Yes.
For downloading that. That'd be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is super interesting. And you teach this stuff, right?
Yeah. So I run parent groups for parents of kids who have a really hard time starting or are really hard on themselves or hate making mistakes, or kids who have these kind of very big meltdowns when things don't go their way. And we go through the framework very much step by step, and we work on surrounding our kids with the structures so that they can develop resilience on their own.
And is that, I know that we said at the top that you're in Brooklyn. Do you do this just locally, or is this available to others too? It's
available nationally and internationally, theoretically. It's on Zoom, and it's small groups of parents, and I try to organize the groups by kind of age or what the kids are going through.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So Zoom based, so people could join from anywhere. All right. We'll make sure we'll put a link to that as well in the show notes, so people can check that out. So all right, and I'm just thinking back here. Resilience is learned but can't be taught. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Okay, I'm just thinking. I'm going off into space here. All right. So now, what about this idea of, like, I think I've heard you say that so far we've been talking about resilience in children themselves. What about resilience, like, as a family unit type of thing? Is that a thing that we should be thinking about and paying attention to?
Absolutely. And especially, I sort of alluded to this, but if we're going to create the conditions at home for our kids, we want to help them see themselves as part of a larger family unit. And so we, as the parent, need to know what is that family unit that we're all going to kind of buy into. And for widowed parents, especially, it's really, I mean, I don't want to minimize how hard that is, and how complex that can be. And so important and powerful, and, potentially very healing for all of you to buy into. Here is our new vision for our family as we walk together into the future.
Which reminds me, I mean, it seems like it relates somewhat. William Worden's Tasks of Mourning, and one of them is about, figuring out what the new role that deceased person is going to have in your life. And it's, as opposed to the old model of, like, okay, well, you have to forget the person and then you can quote unquote move on. Right. And yet the person is not alive and sitting down to breakfast with you every day. So what is that person's new role? How do you bring the memories in? What are you doing with pictures, talking, things like that, and imagining? And there's, for as many people as there are, there's as many different quote unquote right ways for that to look. It's really individual.
Yes. Yeah. And that comes up in the framework when we talk about starting with yourself. One of the components of starting with yourself is to start to tell your own stories of resilience. And so kids, especially elementary age kids, especially, younger kids on the younger end, they're looking to their parent that remains to say, okay, what stories are okay here and what stories aren't? And they understand very quickly, do we get to bring up dad in only in only serious times, or can we bring up dad in funny ways? Or do we get to bring up dad only when we're kind of lighting a candle and thinking about him, or does he get to be kind of a recurring character in our conversations?
Can you bring him up casually in the middle of other conversation, or only when you're sitting down and talking about dad? Like,
Yes. And that's really important. And that can change. There's not one right answer to that. Actually, it's not, let your kids bring them up whenever, or even that they would be comfortable to in the beginning, but it really, that can evolve with your family. But for, the parent to know, okay, my stories about my partner who helped me raise these kids up until now are important, and I can bring them in and I can talk about my hard stuff. Telling your stories of resilience gives parents permission to talk to their kids about times where things were hard. So much is hard for young kids, and so much is out of their control. And it feels like such a big deal, especially for the kids that I work with, when they make a mistake or when they mess up or when something feels out of their control or something feels too hard. And so what parents can do by telling their own stories of resilience is normalizing some of those hard feelings and normalizing the fact that we all go through hard stuff and it doesn't always end beautifully, but we all do make it out to the other side, hopefully.
And this is such an important, one of the things that I've learned is that a lot of kids are afraid of making their surviving parent sad. They're afraid if they share their own grief, the kid, that they're somehow going to upset their surviving parent. And so what you're suggesting of the adult modeling, we can talk about hard things. I can share that I am sad and I am coping, these kinds of things helps model for the kid that those discussions are okay. Yeah.
And just the okayness of it being okay to be sad. This is something that I'm playing with in my own. I have a toddler and I don't know the answer to this for sure, but I'm playing with, is it actually okay to be sad? The quick kind of like wipe away your tears and go on and smile move that we can make as parents. Like, is that necessary, or is it okay to say, you're right, I am sad and soon I won't be, because emotions come and go?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I hear from all the people who run grief centers and stuff, and people who work with grieving children, is that it is important for the kids to see the surviving parent both grieving and coping. It can be destabilizing if the parent is grieving, if the child is witnessing the surviving parent be so upset that they just can't function. That can feel destabilizing, because the surviving parent who's supposed to be, protecting them or whatever is unable to function. That can be, make it harder. But showing that, I am sad and I am coping. Yes. Or I am sad and I'm going to take a walk, and then I'm going to call my sister, and then I'm going to go ahead and make dinner and take you to soccer or whatever, right? Like modeling some of those coping skills.
Absolutely. Yeah. And talking about them after, and telling your story.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for sharing that. Let's see. One of the things, because I know you also have done extensive work in the literacy area.
Yes.
And I know you've talked a little bit about the connection between social emotional learning and literacy. And I think that's so interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. When I was the CEO of Lit Life, I had a mentor, Pam Allen, who had started the company Lit Life, and she is a pioneer in social emotional literacy. And what I learned from her, that I kept learning when I ran around to schools all around the country, is that books can be mirrors or windows. So they can reflect our experience back to us, and just as valuable, they can give us windows into what someone else's life looks like. And we need to, just like with learning anything, anytime you're going to learn anything, you have to care about it to learn it. You decide if you learn. You cannot force feed anybody anything when it comes to learning. So for kids to care about literacy, they have to decide, this is something that's worth my time. This is something that will give me a good time. I have to like reading, to want to read, to then develop the phonetic and phonemic awareness kind of processes to begin reading. There has to be some joy there. There has to be some desire there to even begin. And literacy is just it impacts everything else. And even though it might not feel like this, we are reading and writing more than we ever have before in humanity's history, because we're sending texts and we're, writing Facebook messages, and we're communicating through writing, and we're reading more than we ever have been.
Interesting.
So it's really important for our kids to develop these skills. And one of my programs is the Resilient Reader Program. It's for kids who are struggling with reading in school. And we do very much focus on phonics and phonemic awareness and making sure kids can read. But just as importantly is we do the work with parents and with the kid on building their own positive self-perception and developing the skills to start again when things get hard, because without that, you're not going to read.
Aha. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Well, this is reminding me, I've heard you say that reading is more than an academic subject. So I'm curious if you can share what are some of the benefits of reading, I guess, besides just the academic piece. I mean, you've just shared a little bit about how we're encountering so much written language in everyday life, but anything to add to that?
Yes. I think that COVID really, in addition to everything else, really messed up what we think our jobs are as parents of kids who are learning to read.
Okay, tell us about that.
COVID sort of told parents, hey, you've got to become a reading teacher. And let me tell you, as somebody with a master's in education who is a literacy specialist, you don't just become a reading teacher overnight, and you don't just become a reading teacher because you want to. So reading is a series of hard brain processes. The teacher's job, or the outside help, the tutor's job, is to teach your kid the skills of decoding and fluency. The parent's job is to make reading cozy and feel good. No one can do that but you. You're the one in bed, before bed, reading the bedtime story. You're the one, reading that story during breakfast that they kind of are looking at the book and not at their food and hopefully taking 5 more bites. You're the one doing that. You're the one taking them to the library. You're the one acting out their favorite characters from their books for Halloween. That's you and your job. And the teacher cannot cuddle up with them before bedtime to read them a book. So in trying to be the person who's like, hey, how do you pronounce this? Or let's go over your spelling words one more time. Or, I know you can read that word. I know you can do it. We're taking away from our job of being the ones to make reading feel joyful and exciting and cozy and nourishing and safe. If it doesn't feel joyful and exciting and cozy and nourishing and safe, it's going to be much harder to teach your kid how to read.
So this is interesting. This is reminding me of maybe it's a mixing roles thing. I know when my kids were younger, they're older now, but the teacher would send home monthly reading minutes required, right, with a log. Yeah. And then that puts the parent in the role of policing the child's reading, right? Did you read yet? Did you read 15 minutes? Did you read 30 minutes? How long did you read? And it sounds to me like the opposite of making reading fun and cozy and supportive and nice.
That's right. That's right. And teachers are doing that because it does matter how many minutes a kid reads. But I think that what gets lost in the sort of school to home communication is, when I was a first grade teacher, I told parents any amount of reading up to 20 minutes. Any kind of reading for 20 minutes counted. So I was like, count your 10 minutes before bedtime and count, that audiobook that they're listening to in the car. We're going to count that. The teachers listening, not every teacher is going to agree with that. But the reason being, I didn't want it to be, nope, sit right back down and read for those 15 minutes. And for kids who can read on their own and desire to read on their own, absolutely have them read on their own. But for kids who are struggling, to tell them, sit down and read this book where you can't access half the words for 15 minutes, that's not going to be productive. They're not going to want to do that again tomorrow. So really, and that might have to happen in school, but that's where the parent really has to make the choice of, I'm the leader of this household and my job is to make reading cozy and nourishing and safe. So I'm going to make sure that that's what I do. And if this doesn't feel good, and that's what I give my parents in my program permission to do, if this doesn't feel good, we're not doing it. I tell them for the first 4 weeks of my program, anything that even starts to feel like a quiz, take it away. We're not doing it. Just get yourself off the hook. No spelling homework if it's not easy, and just really focus on those cuddles, that nourishment, and that excitement of a new book.
That reminds me, I got a new book this week.
Yeah.
I'm modeling. And see, I usually read nonfiction because I have so many books to read for the podcast. But I went to an author event this week and it was a fiction book, and I listened to the discussion and I was like, actually, that sounds really good. And it was one of the new books from Zibby Books. Zibby Owens has been on the show before, and she has a new publishing company. Anyway, I'm totally getting us diverted here, but you're reminding me how fun and interesting reading can be. And I think, even like zooming out of kids, back to the adult level here for a second, I'm going to hear from a lot of listeners that reading other people's stories helps, is comforting or interesting or worthwhile in some way to them. Which seems to me then could be modeling for their kids too, that reading is something they choose to do and enjoy in some way or another.
Absolutely. It's modeling and reading, especially when you're going through something hard, reading other people's stories of going through something hard. That's a mirror, and that mirror is really important.
Well, and that's reminding me back to what we were talking about reading not just being an academic subject. I mean, reading those words then is like an entry point into the subject matter that's being talked about in the book or in whatever it is somebody's reading.
Yes. And there are studies that show that reading fiction, so, no offense to all of your beautiful and helpful nonfiction, but reading fiction and narrative nonfiction is the number one empathy builder that we have as humans.
Interesting. Okay. Reading fiction and narrative nonfiction is the number one empathy building tool we have as humans. Okay. I'm going to have to think about that one for a while. Maybe I'll have to add some more fiction onto my plate. I don't know. They keep moving down to my to be read pile,
I know who that is. Yes.
But I have to say I am enjoying this one I'm reading now. So, Good. Well,
what book is it, Jenny? Will you share with us?
Yes, it's called Women Are the Fiercest Creatures by Andrea Dunlop. And she is actually a local Seattle-based novelist. Cool. I think this is like her third or fourth novel. And it's just the second book that Zibby Books has put out. And since it was here in Seattle, I said, well, I'm going to go. And, I don't really read fiction, but I'm going to go and support, them. And I went and I was like, oh, actually, this sounds good. Like I wasn't necessarily planning to read it,
Yes, totally.
So, and I came home and I was like, I'm going to start reading it tonight, because if I don't start it tonight, it might fall to the bottom of the pile again.
That's right.
So that's a good one. Good. Okay. Well, gosh, we've covered so much of this topic here. Is there something that we haven't covered?
The one thing that I do want to say as a former elementary teacher and as someone who's, gone through deep grief of my own is to give parents, and you have experts on your podcast that I've listened to, on how to talk to your kids about grief. And that's not my field, but my field is in elementary education. And I do want to say that giving yourself permission to be really clear with your kids, using words like died, being really clear that they're never coming back, and whatever your religious beliefs are, they're never coming back but they're never coming back, is a really important. I think parents can feel really scared of scaring their kids. And what scares kids is a lack of information, and what is in their imagination is much scarier than, whatever we can tell them. And when we think about resilience with that, not that this is how you wanted to help your kids build it, but kids who have lost a parent are automatically, 10 steps ahead on the resilience building paradigm, because they went through something horrible. They did. And so now, as a surviving parent, the thought could be, how do I help them build these structures to metabolize this terrible thing into a story of, I'm a kid who can do hard things?
Because there are going to be other hard things that come up in life, small ones and big ones and in between ones.
That's right. And the story that we tell ourselves about how we handle hard things is exactly what will come to the surface the next time something hard happens.
So we're back to where we started. The parent can't teach the resilience, but they can, I forget what you said, but basically work to create the conditions to help them learn.
That's right. Resilience is learned and it cannot be taught.
Which is interesting because in my mind, I would tend to put learned and taught together, right? You teach something and then someone learns it, right? Or you learn something because someone taught, right?
The world can teach your kids resilience,
right.
but no, I mean, there's nothing that we can say. There's nothing we can say to our kids that will turn on the light bulb of resilience.
Yeah.
All we can do is over and over and over again, picture our kids inside of a box. All we can do is build the box around them and hope that they, feel safe inside of it. There's really no magic words. There's just, in my experience, there's just systems and structures that we can support them with.
Yeah, as it is with so many things in parenting and in grief, right? You can't grieve for your kid. You can't fix your kid's grief. You can't, if I tell them A, B, and C, then that will fix it for them.
That's right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's not that there's nothing you can do in terms of supports and interactions and conditions you might create and discussions you might have that might help them in their processing their own grief. Yeah, so interesting. Gosh, we could keep talking about this all day, but I do think we had better bring this to a close here. I always like to ask my guests at the end if you could say one thing to widowed parents, and in this case, and I know you've covered a bunch of this, but if you could leave us with one parting thought, one thing to widowed parents about building resilience in their kids, what would you say to us?
One moment will not make or break your kid. So you get to start over every minute. If last minute didn't go well, you get to start over right now. We're all every age we've ever been. And so if you feel like you messed up last week, you get to fix it. And if you feel like you messed up when they were 8 and they're now 15, you also get to fix it.
Such an important point. Okay, good. Well, I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Talia Kovacs, who's a literacy specialist and is focused on building resilience in children. So Talia, where can listeners find you if they'd like to learn more about your work?
You can find me and some really helpful resources, including 5 steps to help your kid use their strengths to solve problems on my website at taliakovacs.com.
All right, great. Well, we will put that in the show notes. And Talia, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Jenny.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Talia Kovacs as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Just look for episode 137. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.